said, this is our second to the last session. So we have today, and then next week, next Wednesday will be our last class. And let's begin as usual with the recitation of the Heart Sutra. So if that could be put up on the screen, and that will be followed by several prayers to help ourselves get into a good state of mind, have a good motivation for being here. Thus have I heard, at one time the Blessed One was dwelling in Rajagriha on Masked Vulture's Mountain, together in one method with a great assembly of monastics and a great assembly of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Blessed One was absorbed in the concentration of the countless aspects of phenomena called profound illumination. At that time also, the superior Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva, the great being, was looking perfectly at the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom, perfectly looking at the emptiness of inherent existence of the five aggregates also. Then, through the power of, could you scroll it down again? Missed that one. Then, through the power of the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said to the superior Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva, the great being, how should a child of the lineage train who wishes to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom? Thus he spoke, and superior Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva, the great being, replied to the Venerable Shariputra as follows. Shariputra, whatever son or daughter of the lineage wishes to engage in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom should look perfectly like this, subsequently looking perfectly and correctly at the emptiness of inherent existence of the five aggregates also. Form is empty, emptiness is form, emptiness is not other than form, form also is not other than emptiness. Likewise, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, like this, all phenomena are merely empty, having no characteristics. They are not produced and do not cease. They have no defilement and no separation from defilement. They have no decrease and no increase. Therefore, Shariputra, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness. There is no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no form, no sound, no smell, no taste, no tactile object, no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so forth, up to no mind element, and also up to no element of mental consciousness. There is no ignorance and no exhaustion of ignorance, and so forth, up to no aging and death, and no exhaustion of aging and death. Likewise, there is no suffering, origin, cessation, or path, no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Therefore, Shariputra, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and abide in the perfection of wisdom. Their minds have no obstructions and no fear. Passing utterly beyond perversity, they attain the final state beyond sorrow. Also, all the Buddhas who perfectly reside in the three times, relying on the perfection of wisdom, become manifest and complete Buddhas in the state of unsurpassed, perfect, and complete enlightenment. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the equal to the unequaled mantra, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, since it is not false, should be known as the truth. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is proclaimed. Dayata gate gate paragate parasam gate bodhisoha. Shariputra, a bodhisattva, a great being, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like this. Then the Blessed One arose from that concentration and said to the superior Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the great being, that he had spoken well. Good, good, O child of the lineage, it is like that. Since it is like that, just as you have revealed, the profound perfection of wisdom should be practiced in that way, and the Tathagatas will also rejoice. When the Blessed One had said this, the Venerable Shariputra, the superior Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the great being, and that entire assembly of disciples, as well as the worldly beings, gods, humans, demigods, and spirits, were delighted and highly praised what had been spoken by the Blessed One. Okay, so the prayers we're saying are to help us think of why we are here. We are learning the Buddha's teachings, and if you don't feel comfortable reciting the words of the prayers, such as taking refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, that's fine. You don't have to recite those, but try at least to generate respect for the Buddha, who gave these teachings in the beginning, and also an altruistic intention to learn these teachings in order to benefit all living beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my practice of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. May all sentient beings have happiness and the causes of happiness. May all sentient beings be free from suffering and the causes of suffering. May all sentient beings be inseparable from the happiness that is free from suffering. May all sentient beings abide in equanimity, free from attachment for friends and hatred for enemies. Reverently, I prostrate with my body, speech, and mind. I present clouds of every type of offering, actual and imagined. I declare all my negative actions accumulated since beginningless time and rejoice in the merit of all holy and ordinary beings. Please remain until the end of cyclic existence, then turn the wheel of Dharma for living beings. I dedicate my own merits and those of all others to the great enlightenment. This ground anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kamneyataya. So now we'll recite the mantra of the Buddha a few times. And while reciting it, it's good if you can imagine that the Buddha is in front of you, made of light, radiant, pure, blissful, and having all positive qualities such as universal compassion and love for all living beings, ourselves and everyone else. Buddha's compassion and love is unconditional. So it doesn't depend on us behaving in a certain way, thinking in a certain way. So even towards those who hate him and oppose him and disagree with him, the Buddha still has love and compassion. Of course, it's helpful if we try to have an open mind and willingness to listen to and learn the Buddha's teachings, because then the Buddha can help us better. But anyway, the point is, it's unconditional love and compassion for everyone, every being throughout space, throughout the universe, no matter what they think, how they act, and so on. And the Buddha has perfect wisdom, understanding the true nature of things, how things actually exist, free of any misperceptions, misconceptions about things. So all the positive qualities that there are, Buddha has these in a fully developed, fully perfected way. And he wants to help us to develop ourselves, to develop these same positive qualities, which are the cause of peace and happiness for ourselves and for others. And he wants us to be free of all suffering and the causes of suffering. Ignorance, greed, hatred, and so on, disturbing mental states, the afflictions. So imagine light flowing from the Buddha into yourself and into all other beings, filling us completely and purifying all that is negative, all suffering and causes of suffering, and blessing our minds so that we can attain all positive qualities, all causes of happiness and peace. Tayata Om Mani Mahamanaye Sum. 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 So really try to have within your mind an altruistic motivation for joining this class, listening to these teachings, which are about the true nature of things as taught by the Buddha, emptiness of inherent existence, true existence. These are really precious teachings that help us clear up our ignorance, our misconceptions about how things exist, so that our mind can be free of all suffering and its causes. And the real reason, according to the Mahayana tradition, for learning about these teachings is so that we can help others, so that they too can become free of suffering and its causes. And so ideally, our ultimate goal in learning about this topic is becoming a Buddha, becoming fully enlightened, to to help all living beings become free of suffering and become enlightened as well. And if it's difficult for you to think that way, try at least to have the wish to benefit others, an altruistic intention, wanting to help other people, other beings, and to help the world as much as possible, and feel the wish to learn something in this session that will help you to be more helpful to others. So, at the end of last week's class, I started talking about dependent arising, sometimes called dependent origination. And this is said to be the king, or we could say monarch, to make it gender neutral, of reasons for realizing emptiness. So it's considered the best reason. And my understanding is that it has that honor because with that one reason, we are able to realize emptiness and avoid what are called the two extremes. So these are two kind of wrong views that most people fall into. Everyone who hasn't realized emptiness falls into one of these two extremes. These are mistaken ways of thinking. So one extreme is, sometimes it's called the extreme of permanence, or other terms for that are eternalism or absolutism. So it has kind of different terms, but according to the Prasangika school, because it is explained differently by different Buddhist schools, but according to the Prasangika school, the one that we're mainly following, the extreme of permanence means believing in things as inherently existing, holding things to exist inherently, truly, objectively, and so on and so forth. So most people fall into that extreme. And the term dependent, independent arising, the first word dependent, eliminates that extreme. It eliminates the extreme of permanence, because the extreme of permanence means believing that things exist inherently or independently. They don't depend on anything else for their existence. They're able to stand alone, be autonomous. So that's what's involved in that particular wrong view. And so understanding dependence, how everything is dependent on other things, therefore nothing is independent, completely independent, standalone. So by understanding dependence, the first part of that term, dependent arising, then we can free ourselves from that first extreme, the extreme of permanence, thinking that things are inherently existing or independently existing. And the second extreme is called the extreme of nihilism. And this is where we deny the existence of things that do exist. And so people can fall into that by thinking, well, there's different ways it can happen, but one way is if you hear something about emptiness, you maybe think about it, but you misunderstand the meaning of emptiness, and you think it means things don't exist. I don't exist. My body doesn't exist. My mind doesn't exist. You don't exist. Nobody exists. Nothing exists. But that does happen. Some people do fall into that mistaken idea of the meaning of emptiness, that nothing exists. So that's the extreme of nihilism. And that's said to be a more dangerous extreme because it can lead to disregarding the law of cause and effect, karma. You think, oh, nothing exists, so anything goes. I can do anything. And I actually heard a story about this. I don't know if it's true or not. It sounds pretty wild, but and I hope I didn't tell it to you already. But anyway, there was a Buddhist conference taking place somewhere, and the people were staying in a hotel. I guess they were using conference room in the hotel and staying in the hotel. And when the conference was over and people were leaving, there was one woman who was, I guess, a Western woman, walking out of the hotel with her suitcase. And the suitcase broke open, it fell open. And inside of the suitcase were all these things from the hotel room. I guess, you know, towels and sheets and whatever she could take. So these must have kind of spilled all over the lobby floor. And when she was questioned about this, she said, "Oh, but everything is empty, isn't it?" So it seems that her understanding of emptiness was, yeah, nothing really exists. So there's no I, there's no you, no ownership of things. So yeah, I can take all these things home with me. So whether that's a true story or it's just a Buddhist myth, I don't know. But anyway, it can happen. It is possible that people have a misunderstanding of emptiness and think that, yeah, nothing exists. So that's the extreme of nihilism. And it's dangerous because it can, if we have that view, we can end up creating bad karma, negative karma. Karma does exist. We do exist, and we do experience the results of our karma. That it can also lead to mental illness. I think I did tell you that story of a woman I heard of who thought she understood emptiness, but her idea of emptiness was nothingness, and she just became like a vegetable. She wasn't doing anything to take care of herself and ended up in the hospital. So yeah, it's a dangerous mistake to make. And so the second part of the phrase, dependent arising, that word, that eliminates that extreme, the extreme of nihilism. Because if things arise, they must exist. You know, if they don't exist, they don't arise. So to fully understand the meaning of dependent arising, of course, we have to study and meditate and so on. But anyway, the point is, if we do have a correct understanding of what it means, dependent arising or dependent origination, that will enable us to find the correct view of emptiness, which is sometimes called the middle way, because it's the middle way between those two extremes, the extreme of permanence on the one hand, or absolutism, and the extreme of nihilism on the other hand. So it's a bit like trying to walk on a tightrope, trying to understand emptiness correctly. You know, it's like walking on a tightrope or a very narrow bridge or something. You know, you have to be very careful about your steps, the steps you take, and try to avoid falling into those two extremes. And so I haven't realized emptiness. I'm still a long way from actually realizing emptiness, but I really like dependent arising. I find it quite helpful to think about it. It's very practical, because when the mind gets caught up in afflictions like anger towards somebody or attachment towards something, thinking about dependent arising can help to relieve the mind of these afflictions, cool down the mind, and see things in a more correct way. Not necessarily all the way to emptiness, but just to see how things don't exist independently, but they depend on other things. So seeing that really helps to decrease the affliction. And so I thought we could start today with a meditation on that. Just seeing how thinking about dependence can help us with an object that we may feel. I'll use an object of attachment, food. I think most people like food, certain types of food. So I'll ask you to bring to mind some type of food that you really like, and then we'll contemplate how this food doesn't exist independently, but is dependent. Something else I was going to say just now disappeared. I guess it'll come back later. Yeah, because when we do have afflictive emotions, either attachment, desire, craving, or anger, aversion, hatred, those kind of disturbing emotions, those are based on seeing things in a mistaken way. The object of that affliction appears to be inherently existing or independently existing, standing by itself, all by itself. So that view of things underlies our afflictive emotions. So if we can see things don't exist that way, then it helps to undermine these afflictive emotions. They won't be as strong. They have nothing to stand on. Okay, so make yourselves comfortable. Try to sit straight, go back straight. Take a few moments to settle down, both physically and mentally. Really do your best to keep your mind right here, right now, on the meditation that we are doing rather than thinking about other things. Put aside other thoughts. And it's always helpful to use the breath as a way to settle our mind down in the present moment, present place. And just be aware of your breathing for a few moments to settle down physically and mentally. So now bring to mind a type of food that you like. Pizza or some kind of dessert. And as you think of it, as you have a mental picture of it in your mind, try to recognize how it seems to be something real, concretely existing over there from its own side, independent of other things, as if it's inherently wonderful and delicious, desirable. And now let's contemplate how this food exists dependently, not independently. So the first way that things exist dependently is on causes and conditions. So think about how this item of food came into existence through people first growing the raw ingredients in the fields and trees, in the process of growing food like wheat, vegetables, fruits, and so on, is a long process. It takes many months, a lot of care, a lot of work. And then it has to be harvested. Again, people doing that work. And then transporting the raw ingredients to a factory where there are, again, people working using different machinery, different utensils in order to refine the raw ingredients, turn it into something edible, delicious for human beings. And then other people package the product, ship it to a market or a supermarket or restaurant where it's put on display. And then we can buy it and bring it home and eat it. So there's quite a long and complicated process that involves many different people and places, factories, machines, different tools, utensils, vehicles, and so forth, in order for this food item to come into existence. Also, whatever does come into existence from causes and conditions is by nature impermanent, meaning it's changing all the time. Every moment, every tiny bit of time, there's changes taking place in that object. And as it changes, it gets older and disintegrates. So if this food item isn't bought and eaten soon, then it will become stale, maybe moldy, and thus inedible, something to throw away, put in the compost. Certainly won't look so beautiful as it does when it's fresh. And the second way things are dependent is on parts. Everything that exists is made up of parts, rather than being one solid monolithic thing. But when we look at things, we usually don't see them like that. We do tend to see them as whole rather than as made of parts. So think about the parts that make up this food item, different ingredients. You can also think of the really tiny parts, like the molecules, atoms, subatomic particles. Try to imagine how it would be if we could see those tiny particles, like atoms, subatomic particles. Do you think that this food item would still appear so inherently delicious, appealing, desirable? The third way that things are dependent is on mental labeling, being labeled. This is more subtle, difficult to understand. But when we see something like a delicious item of food, pizza or cake, we tend to think that it's pizza or cake from its own side, as if pizza or cake exists there in the object, inherently, intrinsically. If that was the case, then we should be able to point to something there in the object, which is pizza or cake. But just now we thought about the parts making it up, down to the tiny parts, the atoms, subatomic particles, and so on. So when thinking about those parts, did we find anything among the parts that we can point to and say that is the pizza or that is the cake? Well, probably not. We probably just found a whole bunch of things, parts, that are not in themselves pizza or cake. And in fact, when we examine the parts, pizza or cake vanish. And we just see a whole collection, a whole mass of things that are not pizza, not cake, just parts. But that doesn't mean there is no pizza or cake, because we can eat that food item and experience some results, like a full stomach and maybe tooth decay if we eat too much cake. So what is the pizza or the cake that we eat and get those results from? So according to Prasangika, it's just what is labeled, what is imputed to all those parts, which are not pizza, not cake, but are called the basis of imputation. So all those parts that make up the pizza or the cake, they are the basis of imputation upon which we give the name, the label, pizza or cake. So pizza or cake exist by being merely labeled onto the parts that make them up. And pizza or cake don't exist inherently, independently of those factors. Any food item exists in dependence on concepts. For example, in the minds of the people who invented them or produced them, just had these thoughts, these ideas. I'm going to make a pizza. I'm going to make a cake. And the process of labeling. People give arbitrary names or labels to food items that they produce. So, in conclusion, again, think about that food item that you thought of in the beginning. And just check how it appears now. Does it still appear in the same way as it did before? Something real, objectively existing, independently existing, attractive, delicious, as it did at the beginning of the meditation? Or has there been any change in the way it appears to your mind? I apologize if any of you found that I was going too fast and you didn't have enough time to contemplate all the things I was talking about. It's always difficult when leading a meditation to know how much time to give people to think about things. In the past, I used to give lots of time. There was a lot of time, a lot of silence. And then I got the feedback. Some people would say to me, so I thought about what you said, and I was just sitting there waiting for you to say the next thing. And so, so since then, I've been speeding up a bit. And I tell people, well, if you didn't have enough time, then you can do it again on your own. So this video is being recorded, so you can always go back, listen to the recording, and you can press the pause button whenever you want. Spend as much time as you want. So that's just to give you some idea about how to use this teaching of dependent arising in a practical way, dealing with objects. And this time I just had you think of an item of food, because like I say, most people do like food. But you could use it for anything. You could use it for a car or a phone or a piece of clothing, piece of furniture, a person. Use it for a person towards whom you have attraction, desire, longing, or anger, aversion. So I find it quite helpful to contemplate these different points. It does help to reduce the strength of the afflictive emotion. And as I mentioned earlier, we are advised to start our exploration of emptiness using our own I, sense of I or me. But I don't know, for me, that's tricky. That's more difficult, more elusive. Whereas using some physical object, like a piece of food or electronic device, can be easier. You can see the parts. You can understand the parts of it more easily. And it does seem to be acceptable to do that, to use a physical object, a material object, and then use your own self, your own I. Because Chandrakirti is one of the great Nalanda masters, Indian master, who he wrote a number of texts on emptiness. And in the monasteries, in the Tibetan monasteries, at least in the Gelug tradition, they spend 4 years or so studying a text by Chandrakirti called Entering the Middle Way, Madhyamakavatara. And that's the main text they use to study emptiness. So in his text, there's a reason that he's famous for. It's called the 7-point reasoning, Chandrakirti's 7-point reasoning. It's not that he invented that reasoning. He actually took a reasoning that was used by the Buddha, and then it was expanded on by Nagarjuna, and then Chandrakirti added a few more points to it. So he made it into a 7-point reasoning. But anyway, his 7-point reasoning, he first talks about it with regard to a chariot. These days, we don't have many chariots around, but we could use a car instead. It works just as well using a car. So we analyze a car and try to find an inherently existing car, and hopefully we won't realize there's no such thing as an inherently existing car. And then, having used it on a car, we use it on ourself, our own self, our I. So it is helpful to start with a more concrete physical object, get used to the reason in that way, and then use it on the self, the I. So it seems to be an okay way to go. So as I was saying, if we get used to how things exist dependently, how they depend on other things for their existence, this helps to undermine our innate ignorance that grasps things as if they were opposite to that, as if they were independently existing or inherently existing. So we have this ignorance about everything, about ourselves, about other people, other beings, about our bodies, our minds, all the material things, and so on. Everything that we perceive, everything that appears to us seems as if it had that way of existing independently, inherently from its own side. And much of the time our mind is buying into that, believing in that, and acting as if things do exist that way. And Buddhism says, no, it's not, or at least Prasangika, Madhyamaka Prasangika says, no, that's not correct. That way of existing isn't true, isn't there. So the more we get familiar with how things are dependent, and at least the first two modes of dependence on causes and conditions and dependence on parts, those are pretty easy to understand, not very difficult to understand. So the more we familiarize ourselves with how things exist in that way, depending on other things, that helps to undermine this ignorance, seeing things as independently existing. Like I say, it's also, even if we don't fully understand emptiness, but just contemplating this can help us to decrease our afflictions, our afflictive emotions. But just thinking about how things are dependent on causes and conditions and parts and so on, that alone isn't enough. It's said that we have to, because that's not so difficult to understand. But in order for this to bring about an understanding of emptiness, we have to first identify what's called the object of negation, or the object of refutation, which is the way that things appear as if they were inherently or independently existing. How our mind sees things in that way. And this is not easy to do. It's actually quite difficult because it's so subtle and it's also so habitual. I think of it like a fish that's born in water and lives its entire life in water, just immersed in this environment of water. So that's the only reality the fish knows. And so a fish, it'd be hard for a fish to be able to stand back from that and say, oh, I'm living in water, as if there was some other way of living. So I think in a similar way, our entire life, we have been living in this way of seeing things as if they are inherently existing, independently existing. It's the only experience we have, the only reality we know. Although it's not reality, it's actually mistaken. But so it's actually quite difficult to step back from that and see how we are seeing things in a mistaken way. But that is something we need to do. We need to be able to recognize this mistaken view we have of things, like our eye or a piece of food or a car or whatever, how that object does appear as if it had inherent existence or independent existence. So we have to catch a glimpse of that and then use the reasonings like dependent arising to check, does that way of existing really exist? Is it possible that the object can exist in that way? And if we do the reasoning well and correctly, we'll realize, no, it doesn't exist that way. The object is empty of that way of existing. So they say that, the first step in realizing emptiness is identifying the object of negation. And then when we use reasonings like dependent arising, we'll be able to hit the target. That's an analogy they use. It's like if you're doing target shooting with, say, a bow and arrow, you like to shoot arrows at a target or darts or whatever. You have to be able to see the target. If the target is hidden or it's in another place, you can't even see the target, then how will you be able to hit the target with your arrows or your darts? So, we have to start by finding the target, seeing the target. And so in the case of understanding emptiness, the target is our wrong view of how I exist, how everything exists. So we have to be able to recognize that. But it's not easy to do because, like I say, we're so accustomed to seeing things in that way. It's hard to step back from that. So recently I was teaching a class for Thupten Norbu Ling on the easy path, the first Panchen Lama. So this is a Lamrim text. And so in that book, the commentary is given by Gyurme Khenser Losang Jampa, a wonderful Lama living right now. I think he's living in San Jose. So yeah, so the book contains the Panchen Lama's, first Panchen Lama's root text, and then Khenser Rinpoche's commentary. And so in that book, Gyurme Khenser Losang Jampa gives a nice explanation, which is based on Lama Tsongkhapa, about how to identify the object of negation. So he says, if you're walking in pitch darkness and you encounter a pillar and you touch it with your hand, it will feel very solid, as if it's really there and independent of everything else, like it doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. There's three ways of dependence: causes and conditions, being built by somebody, parts, different materials that make it up, and being labeled pillar. So it won't appear like that. It won't appear like something that arises from all these other causes and conditions and so on, dependently. Instead, it appears dependently. Sorry, independently existing or inherently existing. He says that's a good way to get a sense of the object of negation, at least with regard to the pillar. And he says the sense of the inherently existing I, self, me is similar to that. It seems to be something really there from its own side, independent of everything else, all these other ways that things are dependent. And he also said it's like a lingering thought, always there in the back of your mind. So it's always kind of there in our experience, this I, real, inherently existing I. And he says, this is how the I appears to the innate conception, grasping inherent existence. So even though that kind of I doesn't actually exist, it's just a fabrication of the mind, but it does appear as if it exists. It appears like it's really there. And we've been believing in it, buying into it for so long, it's almost as if it's taken on its own existence, like it's really there. But when we investigate it, we use reasoning to check if it's true or not, we'll discover it's not true. It's not really there. But we have to go through a process. We can't just say, oh, there is no inherently existing I because the Buddha said so, because Lama Tsongkhapa said so, my teacher said so. That's not the way to go. That isn't the way to eliminate our wrong conception. That's just some superficial idea that we have. But in the meantime, deep down inside, our mind is still grasping at believing in this inherently existing I. So we have to go through this process of first finding this object of negation, the seemingly real, inherently existing I, and then using reasoning to challenge that, to check, does it really exist or not? So I was going to talk about how we could use the reason of dependent arising with regard to this seemingly real I. But maybe before going into that, it's about time to have a 5-minute break. So let's just take a 5-minute break. And then when we come back, I'll go into that. So let's just pretend that we have, oops, got all fuzzy. let's pretend that we have managed to recognize the object of negation in the case of our own I. We've been able to look into our experience and identified how we experience this I that seems to be existing on its own, independently, inherently, truly. Seems to be a real thing right there, undeniably so. Let's just pretend that. And then we'll check to see if this I really does exist independently as it appears. And so the first way of dependence is on causes and conditions. So does our I exist independent of causes and conditions? If so, if our I didn't depend on causes and conditions, that means we wouldn't depend on our parents. We would be able to exist without our parents having met and conceived us, given birth to us, brought us into existence. So we would be able to exist completely independent of that. Is that possible? And also we wouldn't need other things to sustain our life, food, water, air. So if we were locked up in a place, no food, no water, no air, would we be able to exist? Would the I continue existing? So I think that's kind of obvious that we don't exist independent of other phenomena that are causes and conditions for us to come into existence and continue to exist until now. And then the second way is dependent on parts. So if our I could exist independent of parts, then we would not be able to talk about things like my body, my head, my hand, my heart, my brain, and so on. And also my mind, my thoughts, my feelings. So we couldn't make such expressions, because in those expressions, we're talking about different parts of us. So there, if we didn't depend on parts, there would just be one single whole partless thing that is I, and it can't be broken up into parts. And also, if a part of our body became diseased with cancer, for example, we had a cancerous tumor somewhere in our body, we would not be able to have surgery to remove just that one part of us. They would have to remove all of us because we were just one whole monolithic partless thing. So if there's cancer, then all of us have to be removed in order to get rid of that cancer. Couldn't say, oh, I have cancer in my colon, or cancer in my skin, and that has to be removed. Couldn't do that. So these are like absurd consequences. The Prasangika school, the term Prasangika actually means consequence. And so that's what they're famous for. They use consequences, absurd consequences of mistaken views in order to help people who hold those mistaken views to realize that they are mistaken. Okay, so if somebody holds a particular view, oh, there's a real inherently existing I that doesn't have any parts, heartless, whole, then they would throw these kind of consequences. Well, okay, if that's what you think, then you couldn't have surgery to remove a cancerous part of your body because you don't have any parts. And so then that sort of causes the person to go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And then they start rethinking their views. And so this is a technique. It's not just the prasangikas who use that. It's used in other schools as well, other philosophers, when they're debating with opponents, you know, trying to prove that they are right and the opponent is wrong. So it is a common technique, but the prasangikas are particularly make use of this. And then some other absurd consequences. If our I was independent of parts, then it should be exactly the same all throughout time, all throughout our life. So, for example, the I, when we were 1 year old, when we were, the I was 1 year old, and the I of right now should be the same, be exactly the same. And so on, any other time in your life, the I of that point in time and the I of today should be exactly the same without any difference. Because when we talk about the parts of a person, there are different parts during time. For example, there's the I of today and the I of yesterday. The I of today and the I of yesterday are not exactly the same. Our body has changed many times since yesterday. Our mind has also changed many times since yesterday. So we're not exactly the same from one day to the next. And even from 1 hour to the next, from 1 minute to the next, there's changes that take place. And so in a way, it's not like we're a totally new, different person, but still a different person, not exactly the same. And so those are like parts of us, different parts of us, of a person, as they change through time, starting from when they're first born as a tiny little baby, and then they grow and they start walking and so on and so forth. So all throughout time, as our body is changing and as our mind is changing, we can talk about different I's, the I of today, the I when I was 10 years old, the I when I was 1 year old, and so on. And in the future, if we live longer, then there'll be the I of 80 years old, the I of 90 years old, and so on. So these are like different parts of our I, of ourself, of a person. But if the I were independent of parts, it didn't depend on parts, we wouldn't be able to differentiate these different I's over time. We'd have to be exactly the same all throughout time, all throughout our life, which again is absurd. It's obviously not like that. Thank goodness. I mean, imagine if you were a 1 year old child your entire life. What a disaster. Unfortunately, we do grow up. We develop physically, we develop mentally, and so on. Okay, and then the third way of dependence is on mental labeling. Okay, so does our I, the I, exist independent of mental labeling, the process of conceptualizing and then giving a name or a label? So if that was the case, if the I did exist independent of mental labeling, then there would be no need for mind or consciousness to give the label I in relation to this body and mind. I would be able to exist without any thought or any word label I, or whatever your name is, like my name, Sangye Khadro. Sangye Khadro would be able to exist without the need for the mind thinking of that name and then applying that name to this body-mind complex. That's a little hard to understand, but if we think about a newborn child, okay, when a child is first born, the parents decide on a name for that child. They just, whatever name they like. My parents gave me the name Kathleen Ann. I think it was my mother. She's the one who came up with names. I don't think my father was too concerned about that. But my mother, even long before her babies were born, she would think of names for them. If it's a girl, I'll give her that name. If it's a boy, I'll give that name. She was really into naming. So other parents, I think it's only after the baby's born and they'll look at the baby and they'll think, what should we call him? Or what should we call her? And they may, anyway. So there's different ways that parents come up with names for their baby. But that means that the name is given to a child. The child is just named by the parents or whoever is responsible, coming up with an idea about a name and then applying that name to that child. So if the I or any person could exist independent of that process, independent of the process of labeling, then there would be no need to do that. Parents wouldn't have to give a name to the child. The child would come out of the womb and everybody would look at the child and immediately know, oh, that's Kathleen or that's Brian. Because the name would be inherently part of the child's existence and everybody would immediately know it as soon as they saw the child. So obviously that isn't the case. We do not have an inherent or intrinsic name when we are born, when we come into existence. And that's why somebody has to give us a name. Somebody has to think up a name and then apply that name. So that's what we do. And then after the name is given, after a while, people forget that it was just a name invented and applied to that child. And everybody starts seeing that child as if they were inherently Kathleen or inherently Brian or inherently Marvin or Betty or whatever, and almost like the name is an inherent intrinsic part of that person. That's how it seems. Does that make sense? So there is no I. Anyway, the point is, there is no I that exists independent of that process of thinking up a name, mind conceptualizing and thinking up a name, and then applying that name to this object, which doesn't have a name label inherently, intrinsically from its own side. And I think this process of labeling, we do it with people, but we also do it with objects as well. We call, this is a funny one. I find this so funny. They call this a mouse. I don't know why. I think maybe originally they had a cord. There was a cord attaching it to the computer. So maybe somebody thought it looked like a mouse with a long tail. Anyway, this object from its own side isn't a mouse. Okay. But whoever invented this kind of object decided to give it that name, and then it stuck. Everybody calls it a mouse. It's just like conventional. It became the conventional usage that we call that type of phenomena mouse. And I don't think that, this is just my own thought, I could be wrong about this, but I don't think labeling is limited to human minds and our language. I think animals do it too, even though they don't have the same kind of thoughts and language that we do. Because, for example, where I live here in Shrivasti Abbey, there's a lot of forests around, and there's deer. I like to come and visit our garden in the spring and the summer. And there's certain types of flowers that they really like to eat, and other types they don't like to eat, especially tulips. We had some tulips growing outside the dining room at one point in the spring. We woke up one morning and looked out the window, and there were no tulips, just the stems. The stems and the leaves were there, but the flower itself, all gone. So our gardener said, "Oh, tulips are deer candy." For deer, they are like candy, delicious. But they don't do that with other types of flowers. Other types of flowers, they just leave them. They don't touch them. So it seems like in the minds of the deer, they do have some process where they will see one type of flower and just go for it and chomp it up immediately. Another kind of flower they just ignore. So they must have some way of labeling what is delicious and what is not, what is edible and what is not. And also with babies who are pre-verbal, before they've learned language, they've learned the names for things. But they, you can see, I'm sure some of you are parents, and you can see with little babies, there's certain objects or certain people that they're attracted to. They go towards and they want to grab onto, hold on to. And other objects and other people they, want to stay away from, and they maybe even show expressions of dislike and fear and so on. So they don't know the names of those objects and those people, but they still have some kind of process in their mind of labeling. That one is good, I like it. And that one is not good, I don't like it. So things that hopefully, like I say, this third way that things are dependent is more subtle, more difficult to understand. But hopefully those examples that I gave help with an understanding. And in fact, they say that in order to realize emptiness, to really realize emptiness, we do need to understand this third way that things are dependent, how they're dependent on being labeled, merely labeled by the mind. Because the other Buddhist schools, other than the Prasangika school, they do not accept that things are empty of inherent existence. In fact, they say things do exist inherently, independently, but not completely independently, because they do acknowledge that there's causes and conditions, at least for impermanent phenomena. So impermanent phenomena depend on causes and conditions. So all the Buddhist schools agree on that. And so if that was enough to understand that things are empty of inherent existence, then all the Buddhist schools would realize that things are empty of inherent existence, just on the basis of, well, they depend on causes and conditions. And also the second one, dependent on parts. I mean, that's kind of obvious too. It doesn't take a great philosopher to know that our body is made up of parts, and a tree is made up of parts, and so on. So if understanding that things depend on parts was enough to realize emptiness, then many people would realize that. So those first two ways that things depend are not enough to fully realize emptiness. They can help for sure, they do help, but not to go all the way. So to really realize emptiness, we do need to realize this third way of how things are dependent on being merely labeled. Merely labeled. So this term merely labeled is used by the prasangikas, and the term merely in merely labeled, merely is said to refute inherent existence. So merely labeled means it's just labeled and it doesn't exist inherently. It's empty of inherent existence. So the prasangikas say this is true for all phenomena. Whatever exists, even Buddha, even enlightenment, all things, whatever there is, this is how it exists, by being merely labeled by the mind. But it's not easy to understand, and ideally one does need to study the teachings of the Buddha, and explained by Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, and Tsongkhapa, and so on. So it is a matter of studying, and there's lots of little details as well to learn about. So it's kind of a difficult subject, and I don't fully understand it myself either. I'm still swimming, trying to stay afloat in all of this. Okay, so so that's about dependent arising, dependent origination. And then I'd like to go on to, in your in the outline that I sent on the final page, letter E, it says some meditations on emptiness. The first one mentioned there is the 4-point analysis. And this is actually the way of meditating on emptiness that's usually explained in the Lamrim. So you've probably heard it or read it before. So I thought to just go through it today, and we probably won't have time to actually meditate on it. So we'll do a meditation on it next week. Okay, so the first of the 4 points is identifying the object of negation, i.e., e.g., the inherently existing self. Okay, so that's what I was talking about earlier, that we need to, if we really want to do a proper meditation on emptiness and get an understanding of emptiness, we have to start by identifying the object of negation. So in the case of our self, then that would be the inherently existing self. Or if we're using some other object like a car, then it would be the inherently existing car or the inherently existing body. So whatever. So when we do a meditation on emptiness, we choose an object that we want to focus on and use that as an example to understand emptiness. So you can't just think about the emptiness of everything all at once. You start with a specific object, and what we are advised to do is to start with our own self, I, me. That's very close to home because we live with it 24 hours a day. It's always there. And it's also the cause of a lot of trouble. If we believe in our I as real and inherently existing, then that can lead us to get into attachments and aversions and jealousy, and then create negative karma and so on and so forth. So, so it's very important that we clear up that misconception understanding about how we exist, because that will save us from a lot of suffering, a lot of trouble, and also save other people from a lot of suffering, because we have a strong belief in an inherently existing I, and and then we're selfish, we're self-centered, and then we can do all kinds of harmful things to others, cause suffering to others. So it's good for everybody if we can clear up this misunderstanding about the way we exist. And so, but it's not easy. Like I said, it's not easy. In fact, I've read somewhere that even yogis, meditators who are in full-time retreat, really spending all day long meditating, and when they are working on this particular topic and trying to understand the emptiness of their self, they may spend a year just getting this first point, just being able to identify the I that they feel and they hold on to kind of deep in their heart, just to be able to get a glimpse of that. And so that means yogis, they're usually living in a quiet, isolated place, not having a lot of activities, able to do a lot of meditation. So the mind gets relatively quiet and peaceful. And so even then, in those kind of conditions, it takes a long time to really identify this I. So those of us who are not in that situation, but we're busy doing lots of things and talking to people and thinking many, many, many other things, it's much more difficult. When our mind is really busy, it's harder to see the inherently existing I. Although they do say we can use experiences where we have a strong emotion coming up, some emotional reaction, anger or attachment or excitement or fear. So in those moments, there's a greater chance that we'll be able to catch a glimpse of this I that seems to be so real, concrete inside of us, feeling that emotion. But then it's difficult to do that because you're so caught up in the emotion and the situation that's triggering that emotion. So it's quite hard to have the presence of mind at that moment to be able to say, aha, where's this I? What's this I? But you can remember that experience afterwards and then try to get a glimpse of the I. But being in a retreat situation, quiet, isolated, not so many activities, then it's easier. It's a better situation to be able to recognize the I. But I was thinking that as a suggestion, you might try that experiment that I mentioned earlier, which is explained in the Easy Path. Go, have the room completely dark, or put on those eye shades you get on the airplane, so you have no light coming in, and then just walk towards an object. It doesn't have to be a pillar. Most of our houses don't have pillars, but a table or a light switch or a chair or something. Kind of just walk towards that object, reaching out, trying to find it. And then when you do actually find it, just pay attention how that object appears. As Lama Tsongkhapa says, it seems to be real, really there, independent of anything else, causes, conditions, and so on, real and solid. So that's just with regard to some physical object. But then see if you can look inside yourself and notice the sense of I, and how that also appears to be something real and solid, not solid so much in the sense of made of material substances, but solid in the sense of undeniable, really there, existing on its own, objectively, independently, almost like it's screaming out to us and saying, I am here, I exist, I am real. So just try that as an experiment. Okay, so then that's the first of the 4-point analysis. And then the second is called becoming certain about the pervasion. Becoming certain about the pervasion. Okay, so the pervasion means if this I really does exist, then there are only two possible places we could find it, or two ways that it could exist. These are the only two possibilities. There's no other possibility. And so the two possibilities are, first, that it's the same as the aggregates, or one with the aggregates. We'll go into these a little later to make it clear. Or just in this kind of simple, ordinary language, it can be found somewhere within our aggregates of body and mind, somewhere within this mass, this collection of physical and mental components. So that's one place we could find it. The other possibility is somewhere else, outside of, I mean, I'm putting this in really simple language that makes sense to me. The technical language they use in the teachings isn't quite the same. They say one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates, one or different. So the way I understand that is we can either find it within our aggregates of body and mind, somewhere in here, or outside, anywhere, which means it could be anywhere in the universe other than this body-mind complex. So those are the only two possibilities where we could find the I. Then there's no other possibility. So with the second point, you need to think about this and become certain that those are the only two possibilities for where the I could exist, or how the I could exist, either within our aggregates of body and mind or somewhere else. And there's no third possibility. Because even if you say, well, maybe on the moon, maybe my I could exist on the moon. Well, that's the second possibility. That fits into the second possibility. Or if you think, oh, I can find my I in my brain. My I is my brain. Well, that's the first possibility. It's within your aggregates. So any possible place we could imagine the I to exist, any way that it could possibly exist, will fit into these two possibilities. That's the meaning of pervasion. Either it's here or it's there. There's no third possibility. So the meditator needs to think about this and become convinced these are the only two possibilities. Because with the last 2 points of the 4 points, 3 and 4, we're investigating each of those two possibilities. And if we cannot find the inherently existing I in either of those two places, then the obvious conclusion is it doesn't exist. And that's emptiness. That's the meaning of emptiness. So the third, number 3 of the 4, is checking if the inherently existing self is one with the aggregates. So this is language used in the philosophical texts, philosophical teachings. One with, it could also be translated as same as the aggregates. So this is a little complicated because what we are looking for here is an inherently existing self. Okay? Not just a merely labeled self, but an inherently existing self, because that's how it appears. It appears to be something inherently existing, independently existing. So if if the inherently existing self did exist, and if it was one with or the same as the aggregates, then they have to be exactly the same, absolutely the same in every way. Our I and our aggregates have to be absolutely the same, absolutely one. And it took me a long time to figure that out. And I'll share with you what I came to. This is how it makes sense to me, but you can find your own way of making sense of it. The reason they have to be absolutely the same in every way, and there's no difference at all between them, is because if there was a difference, even a tiny difference between the I and the aggregates, if there was any difference at all, you'd have to explain that difference. There would have to be a reason to account for that difference. What makes the I different from the aggregates? And if we can find a difference, if the I is different from the aggregates, then that means it would be dependent. It would have to depend on something that makes it different. And as soon as you say it's dependent, it depends on something making it different from the aggregates, then it can no longer be inherently existing, independently existing. Because again, we're looking for an inherently existing I, and an inherently existing I, if it existed, would be totally independent of everything else. And if it's independent, then it would always be the same, exactly the same. It couldn't change in any way, because if it changes, then that means something has made it changed. So then it's dependent on something making it change. I don't know if that makes sense. Anyway, I thought about this a lot, and this is what I came to, and it made sense to me. So difference would not be possible within inherent existence. The I, if it's an inherently existing I, and if it's one with the aggregates, same as the aggregates, within the aggregates, it has to be exactly the same as the aggregates without any difference. So based on that, and this is what they say in the teachings, you'll find it in all the teachings. Based on that, then there are various absurd consequences. So one absurd consequence is that, so if the I is one with the aggregates, then just as there are 5 aggregates, there would have to be 5 I's, 5 of us. And Lama Zopa Rinpoche once made a joke about this. He said, well, if there are 5 I's, then it would be very expensive to travel, because when you travel, you would have to buy 5 tickets. You'd have to buy 5 seats on the airplane or the train, because there's 5 of you, not just one. There's 1 I for each aggregate. So you'd have to have 5 seats on the plane. You'd probably have to have 5 passports as well. So that would be quite complicated. Arriving at customs and pulling out 5 passports, 1 passport for each of your eyes. So that's obviously absurd. There's only one of us when we travel. We just buy one ticket, 1 seat on the plane. We have just 1 passport. Well, actually, some people have more than 1 passport. They have dual citizenship. But still, it's probably the same name. You don't have different names on your different passports. You have the same name, but different nationalities. But anyway, so that's one absurd consequence, which is obviously absurd. We're just one person. Or the other alternative would be, if we are just one person, then we should have only one aggregate. We wouldn't be able to divide ourselves up into different parts, like body and mind, feelings, and so forth. There would just be one whole monolithic, partless thing, which is I. I and aggregates would be absolutely one. So these are things we need to think about. And it is helpful to read the text. If you read Lama books and other books about Madhyamika philosophy, you'll come across these. I've heard these teachings for years and years and years, and it took me a long time to start making sense of them. So, but, in the monasteries, like I say, they spend 4 years or more studying Madhyamika philosophy, and they memorize the text, they listen to teachings, and they spend a lot of time debating with each other. And so they really spend a lot of time going into these different arguments and working out their doubts and their uncertainties and their questions and so on. And even for them, it's difficult. It's quite difficult, quite challenging. So anyway, those are some absurd consequences of saying that our I, an inherently existing, independently existing I, is one with our aggregates. Another approach we could take would be to try to search for this inherently existing I. So if we really do believe there's a real I, inherently existing I somewhere inside of us, where is it? The Lama Zopa Rinpoche composed a meditation on this, which is included in my book, How to Meditate. So that's something you could try to do. Searching for the I. I think it's just called Meditation on Emptiness, but it's basically searching for the I, going through the different parts of the body, different parts of the mind, and trying to point to if this I really exists, which it seems to be there, where is it? Can you point to something in your body and your mind and say, that's the I, right there, that's it, that's me. So that's another approach we could take. Another consequence to saying that the I is one with the aggregates or within the aggregates would be, again, if it's an inherently existing I, then it has to be absolutely one with the aggregates in every way, not different at all. So if that was the case, then whatever is true of the I should be true of the aggregates and vice versa. So for example, if we say, I am a Buddhist, then that means my body would be a Buddhist. My nose would be a Buddhist. My finger would be a Buddhist. Sounds kind of weird, isn't it? Or if I say, I am thinking, then my body should be thinking. My nose should be thinking. My little toe, my big toe should be thinking. My toenail should be thinking. So again, these are like absurd consequences to saying there is an inherently existing I, independently existing I, and it's here in my aggregates. So then the aggregates, every part of the aggregates and the I would have to be absolutely one thing. Okay, so there's actually other consequences as well. I'm just giving you the easy ones, relatively easy. The others are much more complicated. So I'm not going to go into those. So that's number 3. Then point number 4 is investigating the other possibility, which is the I. What does it say? Checking if the inherently existing self is different from the aggregates. Okay, so if, again, we're talking about an inherently existing self, inherently existing I, meaning it's independent, standalone, autonomous. So if that's that type of self, that type of I really did exist, and it wasn't, we can't find it within the aggregates, then the only other place we could look would be outside of the aggregates, which means, anywhere else. But that's actually quite easy to to dispel that kind of idea. Because if this was the case, if there was an inherently existing I that was separate, different from the aggregates, then we could have absurd consequences, such as your body and mind, your aggregates, could be sitting at home and your I could go for a walk. Or the other way around. Your I could stay at home and watch TV, and your body and mind could go for a walk. That would be kind of fun. Like, you know, people, I don't know how many of you have to go to work, but wouldn't it be cool if we could send our body and mind to work, and we could stay at home and meditate or watch TV or go swimming or whatever. I'm sure many people would love to do that. I'll send my body and mind to work. They can go and do work, and I'm going to stay at home. I'm going to relax at home. So we'd probably love to be able to do that if that was possible, but obviously it's not. So, and also just, I don't know, the way we feel, at least the way I feel. I never have the feeling of I being somewhere else. I always feel it here, wherever my body, mind is, wherever my aggregates are, that's where I feel I. You know, that's how it feels. I mean, there are people who talk about doing astral travel. People have that kind of experience, going out of their body. I guess sometimes it happens in dreams, lucid dreams. I heard someone describing this, you know, going out of their body and looking at their body, lying there on the bed. They're outside their body, looking at their body. That would be quite interesting. But they always come back. I mean, it's only a temporary vacation from your body, and then you come back. But but for me, in my experience in my life, I've never had that kind of experience. Although I've wanted to. I want to get out of this body, driving me crazy, but I can't. But so I always have my feeling of I, my sense of I here, where my body and mind are. So that fourth point, I think it's quite easy to realize that isn't possible. But anyway, the point is, if we do these 4 points, if we go through these 4 points really well, we first get a sense of an inherently existing I, which is what we do feel about ourselves. And then we realize if it exists, if there really is such an I, there are only these 2 possibilities where I could find it, either within my aggregates or outside of my aggregates. And then if you thoroughly investigate each of those 2 possibilities, then the result is an experience of emptiness. You don't find your I, and the I vanishes, it disappears, not there. So sometimes we may get just momentary glimpses of that experience of emptiness, and it can be quite unsettling. You know, people can feel quite frightened. I'm disappearing. I'm going out of existence. Actually, they say that's a good thing. It means we have done the meditation well, and we shouldn't get caught up in that fear and believe in that fear, because it just means we are getting an experience of reality, the truth. The truth is, I don't exist the way I have always thought. That seemingly real, solid I isn't really there, doesn't really exist. So we should stay with that experience as long as we can and let go of the fear, put aside the fear if you can. But again, I think it's important to have a good understanding of emptiness, to study it and have a good intellectual understanding of what emptiness means. And then there's less chance of having that fear, or even if the fear comes, you won't be bothered by it. You won't be affected by it. You will continue with your meditation. So yeah, don't be surprised if you do have fear. If you do have fear, that means you did a good job. Although what they say, what I've heard is, yeah, some people have a feeling of fear, and some people have a feeling of joy. It depends on how well you've prepared beforehand, how well you understand emptiness. But even the Dalai Lama, he talks about feeling fear. He said he was studying a text explaining emptiness. And this was after probably many years of learning about meditating on emptiness. So one day while reading this text, he suddenly got it. He lost his sense of self. And he said it was like being struck by lightning. And it was really painful. But he probably had enough knowledge and enough strength of mind and conviction and faith in the Buddha and so on to not be bothered by that. But if even the Dalai Lama has that kind of experience, then it's possible we will as well. But we should just not take it seriously and just realize, oh, we did something right. We did it right. But yeah, when we study emptiness, we also learn that emptiness doesn't mean non-existence. Emptiness of the self or the I doesn't mean I don't exist at all. I just don't exist the way I always thought. But there is still conventional existence, a conventionally existing self or I. So if you've learned that and you're certain about that, confident in that, then that will sustain you. Everything won't fall apart. You won't disappear into the void forever. So we'll do a meditation on this next week. And between now and then, continue trying to explore your sense of self, sense of I, try to get a sense of how it does seem to be something very real existing on its own. So I've gone a little bit over time. And if you have questions, you can send those in, and I'll do my best to answer them. So now we need to conclude by reciting the prayers, the dedication prayers, dedicating on merit. So feel confident we have accumulated merit, because just trying to understand emptiness, even if we feel it's difficult and confusing, but just making the effort to learn about emptiness is very beneficial. We do create a lot of merit. And I will share this merit with others, other people and other beings. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Incomparably kind and supreme Tenzin Gyatso, the wish-fulfilling, wish-granting jewel, source of every benefit and happiness in this world, may you have a long life and all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three sublime ones. Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please lift them. Okay, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Anna. And we want to Dr. Noble Ling for organizing, hosting.
Thank you.